So a little bit about Fixu, more just some clarifications behind where this data comes from. So we've worked with about 4,500 apps. We tend to work with some of the largest apps in the App Store. I would say at least half of our clients buy on our DSP platform, so buy RTB from us. And I'd say at least half of those are buying in the US and EMEA. So I'm going to go into some very specific performance data around the two that we'd like to share with you today. So again, any questions along the way, happy to answer them. One thing I will note is we did use historic benchmarks across all clients running on RTB. We didn't pull out just games. So we certainly do some game indexes. If anyone's interested in that particularly, they can send me an email. Well, just a little bit about Fixu and what we do. We use our proprietary data, we use clients' data, we use third-party data providers to build audience segments to target. We will then use our reach on Facebook, Google, our DSP platform, which I'm going to go into today. There are about 20 some odd networks that we work with right now that allow us to syndicate audiences to. So we then build those audiences, we syndicate those audiences, and then we use performance data to optimize around those audiences. So fairly straightforward, all identifier-based, all in-app media, and leveraging that data to find the best audiences that work for our clients. So programmatic to us, I think, is much broader than the traditional thoughts just behind RTB. But the majority of inventory we're buying today, we consider programmatic. So we're buying through an API, we're getting reporting through an API, and we're doing all of our optimizations through an API. So people certainly do get involved at different points in a campaign, but almost all of the media we're buying today is done full cycle by a machine. And we are going to just focus on RTB today. But when looking at statistics, eMarketer was one of them, shows programmatic on the rise. You have to watch some of these statistics. The eMarketer statistic uses all programmatic media buying, not just RTB. If you look at just RTB, it's a little bit lower than this, but it's certainly heading in the right direction. If we look at the percentage of display spend, so this is just RTB that we're seeing, the majority of it in EMEA is still non-programmatic, and in the US, it's getting to that tipping point. So there may be some publishers direct that we'll work with, but in the US, we're specifically focused on that 49%, and in EMEA, we're focused on that 36%. So this data is certainly going to skew towards what is available programmatically today. And what are some of those sources? I mentioned this, but RTB is where we're going to focus today, but also Facebook, Twitter, AdWords, but I would add to that list AOL, Yahoo, and quickly more and more inventory is becoming programmatically available to all media buyers. So RTB is what we'll focus on, real-time bidding, traditional DSP bidding through an exchange infrastructure. We built our own bidder. We were doing RTB since OpenRTB in the early days, so there weren't a lot of options for us except for us to build our own. Three types of RTB, although I'm going to focus on all of the data we pulled today was from what we consider OpenRTB. So this is RTB inventory that's available through the exchanges. We do private exchange relationships or private marketplaces. Some of you might have heard of this as deal IDs. So you can work with particular publishers, you can work with particular subsets in any of the exchanges, and they pass you a particular deal ID. So this opens up what otherwise might not be inventory that's available to you on the general exchange, and it would certainly skew some of the data we're going over. We do some preferred. I think I read an interesting article about Criteo recently. They do almost all of their RTB bidding through preferred agreements, and this is just buying out inventory in some sort of an upfront. So if you're willing to buy out inventory from a publisher that you know will perform well for you, you guarantee them a CPM, and they guarantee you a fixed number of impressions. We do not do a lot of the preferred side. I would say the majority of it is coming from OpenRTB, and when we find big publisher networks that perform well for us, we will do private exchange agreements with them as well. So this is a breakdown of the traffic that we saw in, I believe this was the last 4 weeks of Q3. So this is all of the RTB, OpenRTB bid requests that we saw. 48% of it in the US, 27% of it in EMEA. So the data that we're going to go around is from this data set. Rest of world, fairly small, but Asia is certainly coming on strong. What are we buying through RTB? We're buying native, we're buying video, we're buying display, and we're buying interstitials. And I'm going to actually go through a breakdown of what we're seeing as far as inventory levels there and costs and performance on each of these. So available inventory format, this is a worldwide chart. So I'll give you the comparisons as we go in. The majority, of course, that's still available is standard. So the majority of inventory out there available to us is banner ads. This is probably a good note to mention. One of the reasons, we were pleased to cover this topic for Casual Connect. One of the things that we see often when clients come to us is they have preconceived notions when working in a specific territory that they want to apply to other territories. So as you're moving from a US campaign into EMEA, as you're moving from an EMEA specific campaign, moving into the US, even I've seen clients focused on the UK, then moving into Germany, you have to be cognizant of things like this. Often we'll have clients come to us and they'll say, oh, well, we ran a test campaign in Germany and it didn't work out for us. And then we'll dig into it a little bit, and turns out they were only buying interstitials, and interstitial inventory really wasn't available in Germany. So they figured that the audience wasn't there, they made some presumptions about performance of the game, when really as you start to dig into specific regions, particularly EMEA versus the US, you should start with a clean slate and really be focused on what's available there. So if we look at this first slide, standard, about par, right? So there's, as far as the rest of the world goes, EMEA's right on track with having the majority of its inventory being available through display. But video is much smaller in EMEA. So there's not a lot of video inventory available, but native is much more prevalent. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, but one of the reasons why we believe that native is much more prevalent through programmatic buying in EMEA is because the majority of the inventory there is in-app. So in-app tends to be much easier to buy programmatically when it's in-app. And then interstitials, a little bit less than video, but it's interesting that you can buy more interstitials in EMEA than you can video. So when we layer in the rest of the world, of course, right along suit with everyone else, APAC is right up there. Even less video, even less interstitials, but again, more native video. So we'll go into some of the statistics. Again, if there's any questions along the way, I can go through them. So these are these global baselines. So what we did is we looked at this 4-week period of time, and we looked across all campaigns that were running on RTB. We saw the average eCPM, and these are in US dollars, were a little under $1.30. Average click-through rate was about 4.4%. Average CPC was less than about 3 cents. Click-through rate was a little less than 1%, and average CPIs were a little above $5. So again, this is apps and games. This is all performance across all RTB. If we look at North America, eCPMs are higher than average. Click-through rates are lower than average. CPCs are higher than average. Conversion rate, which is that CR, lower than average, and of course all those equal to a CPI being higher than average. Now, all of these statistics, of course, being higher in the ways you don't want them, lower performance on click-through rate and conversion rate, higher cost on eCPM, CPC, and CPI. I think one of the key things that we see in our US campaigns is that the users we're able to get through RTB tend to be much more prevalent from a downstream purchaser. They look a lot more like Facebook than any other place where we're buying RTB inventory. So we're willing to pay more. And I guess one thing to note too, Fixu is completely performance-based, so all of our campaigns are actually optimizing around LTV. So there's some downstream performance matrix that is willing to let these CPIs and CPCs be a little bit higher. EMEA goes in the opposite direction. Average eCPMs tend to be lower than usual, click-through rates are a little bit higher, CPCs are lower. Conversion rate though is also lower. So it keeps the average CPI up a little bit from the global average. Now we've done a little bit of research on this, still figuring out whether it's App Store optimization, whether it's users. We don't see the CPIs or the click-through rates being that much higher, so we don't think it's just a higher propensity of people in EMEA to accidentally click on an ad, but their conversion rate from clicking on an ad to actually downloading the app is much lower. One of the things that we've seen here is when looking at the RTB calls, it's much more prevalent to get public IP addresses, a lot of those being from cell networks, and we do believe that that's cutting the performance on the CTR side. The consumers in EMEA seem much more conscious about apps they're willing to download based on their size. So we do believe when you get into the App Store that some of the bigger games, some of the larger apps that we see, it drops conversion rate fairly quickly. So we've done some things around that. You can target known public Wi-Fi networks. You can target the consumers when they're at home with what you believe to be their known home Wi-Fi network. And when we do that, we certainly see this conversion rate on the campaigns go up. Problem with that is the scale gets much smaller. So often you're paying more, lower scale, higher conversion rates. So in some instances, you just have to make the choice whether you're willing to sacrifice that performance and catch those consumers when they're out and about. So now we're looking at same statistics, just EMEA versus the rest of the world, and digging into color chart there, native, interstitials, video, and display. And this is where it gets interesting. As we make these presumptions as we bring campaigns from one country to another, or running campaigns in the US to somewhere internationally. eCPMs, lower across the board. Click-through rates, higher across the board, except with display. Video having the best click-through rate in EMEA, although one of the struggles, of course, that we've seen, but I know that there are several of the great video display networks and the video exchanges looking for more inventory in EMEA, but click-through rates being the highest in EMEA on video, but as I showed in one of the previous charts, it's the lowest available source of inventory. CPCs lower across the board, with interstitials having the lowest, and here's the conversion rate. So native, again, having the lowest conversion rate, display having a lower conversion rate than the average, and interstitials and video outperforming everything else. So again, these balances of interstitials and videos having the best downstream performance from click to someone actually downloading the app, but lowest available inventory. So the majority of the inventory is still coming from display, which isn't performing too bad, and then native, which is, as I showed in an earlier slide, bigger than video. I think it's bigger than video and interstitials combined. And then the last is CPI. So CPI is lower across the board, except with video. So as you kind of look through these stats, you can kind of see that they all back out to these CPI numbers. So although CPI or video has the highest performing click-through rate, all the other ways to measure them are a little lower than the global average, so the CPIs end up being much higher. But again, if you're watching the downstream performance, then video is one of our stronger performers. There's just not enough of it. So these are just some breakdowns, and I'm happy to share this slide with anyone. And the key takeaway here is that EMEA, from a cost perspective, is about on par with the rest of the world. It's certainly less expensive than the US, but you have to be careful as to how you're buying that media. Display is going to be much more prevalent. Video is going to be available to you. Native Native is one of the most popular sources there, and we'll talk about that now. So ad placements by source. So Fixu being performance-based, being in the app space for as long as we have certainly done a lot of testing in mobile web, but almost all of the inventory we buy is in-app. So this data skews from a Fixu perspective to in-app data. It's just interesting as we pull some third-party data as to how much of the inventory is actually available in-app. So as you can see, the majority of inventory, so these two boxes would equal 100%. You can see that in EMEA, there's much more inventory available in-app than there is from mobile web. Now again, this may skew towards us, but even in the US, we still see a ton of mobile web inventory. Almost all of it in EMEA is available in-app. And why that's important? Well, actually, there's one more slide here before we skip to that one. EMEA also skews Android, about proportional with the US. And we didn't put APAC in here. I think as everyone might know in the room, as soon as you added APAC into the room, it skews almost all the way to Android. One note that I'll make about this is we have done some testing on RTB, and one of the interesting things that we found is that if you're targeting by device, so some of the exchanges will let you target by device. If you can't target by device, you can usually target by operating system, and most of the lower end devices don't support the newest operating systems. And we see that a $700 phone, no matter where it is in the world, performs like all the other $700 phones. So there's often lots of talk about how the iOS users are much more valuable than the Android users. That may be true overall, but if you're targeting the high-end Samsung devices and you're comparing that to a $700, let's say, iPhone 6, those users are about at the 98th percentile. So almost their propensity to purchase, their LTV, is almost identical to those of the iPhone users. And we've seen that in the US, where we have the most data, but we've certainly seen that in EMEA and APAC. So when targeting on the Android devices, certainly start looking at some of the higher end devices, and you can limit your campaign that way, especially through Google. And they'll allow you to do a lot of cool things from a targeting perspective. Identifier-based buying. I think one of the key things for us, especially around making performance work on the RTB side, is being able to target identifiers. So if you're building that audience, if you're retargeting consumers, if you want to do ad suppression, RTB is a great place for that. So I mean, there's the whitelisting of users. So these are the new users that I want to find. And again, whether they're existing users that you're retargeting, or maybe you're building using a third-party data provider, or someone like Fixu to build segments of users that you want to target. But I think the blacklisting is equally important. It's amazing to me how often we will take over a campaign or work with a client, and they're just buying media on RTB, and they're doing a good job optimizing around that, but they're not suppressing any of the users that they've already seen. So step one to me in an RTB campaign is upload all your existing users to your partner and make sure you're doing ad suppression, and treat those users as some sort of retargeting campaign. Focus on the new users, and that's the great thing about being identifier based. So not all ad calls in the US have identifiers, not all ad calls in EMEA have identifiers, but you can see that it skews much heavier in EMEA. I think this is the networks are newer, the exchange infrastructure is newer. I kind of saw what we were doing in the States, brought that over internationally, and they realized how important identifier-based buying was going to become, and it's evident in the infrastructure that's available to us. Quick case study. A traditional brand that we were working with in EMEA, trying to bring their users into an app environment. When targeting the users correctly and using RTB, we saw much higher click-through rates, we saw much higher conversion rates, and we even saw better LTV than any other campaign that we were running. So for this instance, we ran Facebook, Twitter, I'm sure there was some Google in there as well, and then RTB through the OpenRTB platform. and having the right creative, certainly they focused on video and interstitial, had RTB performed better than anything else that we had seen. So in summary, and running out of time, so if any questions? No? All right, in summary, I think that opening statement that I made, don't make presumptions when possible that your campaign is going to perform the same in a different geo. And this certainly, there's a lot of interesting inventory in South America, which we didn't even go into, in APAC, but even the difference between the US and EMEA. I mean, often we'll see a soft launch targeting Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, and they may make some general assumptions about those campaigns and then launch in the US and then move to EMEA, and they'll run into problems because they don't have the right creative type, or they'll believe that the game or app isn't performing, and it's actually just a lack of the proper media mix based on the territory. And that's it. There's my email address if anyone wants this presentation. You can follow me on Twitter. It's Spencer E. Scott. There is another Spencer Scott, but put in the E and you'll find me.